Hello, and you're listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame, featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Welcome, I am Jack Eit. On today's show, the Climate Water Project, Rehydrating the Earth. Host Carrie Kim will be interviewing Alpha Lowe, who publishes the Climate Water Project newsletter and hosts the Climate Water Project podcast. Alpha Lowe operates as an investigator and researcher into the interaction of ecology and climate via the water cycle. He studies how to restore our water cycles and is working on numerous eco-restoration projects. He comes from a background in physics and permaculture and teaches about water and permaculture designs courses. His Substack and podcast focus on, of course, the water cycle and how leveraging these forces helps with hydrating the earth and soil, replenishing groundwater, restoring rains in drought areas, lessening flooding, and slowing down climate change.
Aloha, this is Carrie Kim. Listeners, today we welcome Alpha Lowe, investigator, researcher who has committed himself to a global exploration and deep inquiry into the restoration of water cycles. We thank the Tongva ancestors for their enduring presence, legacy, and leadership as our show comes to you from the ancestral homelands of the Tongva and all of their relatives. And we encourage listeners to align and act with Native nations of the place where you now live. Reach out to local tribal councils, volunteer at heritage sites or Indigenous restoration projects, donate to Indigenous land trusts, and support the Land Back movement. These are some ideas to support the legacies of the Indigenous peoples where we live. May we act in solidarity with them and do our best to ensure their cultural heritage and lifeways remain for generations to come. Water, water everywhere. Or perhaps there used to be a great deal more water everywhere, particularly in the soil. The Climate Water Project, started by Alpha Lowe, is a resource for understanding how we might help to restore the water cycle, hydrate the earth and the soil, replenish groundwater, and transform the drought, fire, flood cycles affecting various regions of the world, and slow down, or at best, reverse climate change. It is possible and already happening around the globe in certain countries. While it is not yet happening at scale, we can keep our sights and actions moving towards this possibility. Restoring the water cycle, particularly through regenerating the soil and reforesting or greening the planet for longer, can indeed change the trajectory of this planet. For life to continue, it is imperative for us all to participate in slowing water, the small water cycle, and restoration of groundwater, local watersheds, and rainfall. Alpha Lowe of the Climate Water Project joins us now to talk about all things water and how we might participate in its return. Welcome, Alpha. Many thanks for your research and dedication to helping others engage in restoring water cycles locally and globally, and rebalancing the small and large water cycles.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Alpha is coming to us from Portugal this morning. You know, Alpha, I understand that your father was a water scientist of sorts. What prompted you to become such a champion of restoring the hydrological cycle?
Well, I was living in California, and I was concerned about all the wildfires, and also concerned, about the environment and climate in general. And as I was kind of reading, I was reading that the water cycle is also really important in the whole environmental and climate area, and that there's actually something called the small water cycle which could be restored. And I was like, wow, people are looking only at
Carbon.
the carbon, reduction of fuel load, reducing, the trees and other things to stop all the wildfires in the west coast of the US and also elsewhere in the world. No one was looking at the water thing. So I started looking at that because of the wildfires and also because of a general concern about climate and environment. And I come from a bit of a permaculture background where there's a lot of water restoration work.
Well,
My dad was a physicist at Caltech, a visiting professor at Caltech, and from the Melbourne University, and he was researching water. So I'd done some research on the microscopic properties of water, but now has now turned to the macroscopic properties of water.
So were you a permaculturist before you started exploring about the small water cycle? I mean, you were already working in those ways.
Yeah.
But then what drew you to permaculture? Because something, what's the trajectory here?
Well, actually, I had a roommate. She was going to a permaculture school, and I was really interested in design thinking. And there's a lot of design thinking in permaculture. Like, how do you apply this nature's design thinking and all the natural ways of kind of tapping into that natural energy that's already happening, as opposed to some of our more forced agricultural ways where we're inputting different things as opposed to looking at the natural ways. Yeah, so I got really intrigued with this, the design thinking aspect of permaculture, and got into it that way.
Wow. Well, could you actually first explain what is the small water cycle? I know a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, so there's a large water cycle, which is the water coming in from the ocean, flowing in and then creating rain and then flowing out through the rivers back to the ocean. So that's a large water cycle. And then the small water cycle is where the water is on the land and then goes into the air and comes back down to the land. So that's a cycle. Or it starts in the air and then rains out and then evapotranspires back up to the air. So that's a small water cycle. And it turns out that actually a significant part of our rain is made up of water that's evapotranspired. And so, in fact, more than the water flowing from the ocean. And so there is a tendency in our schooling to think most of the water comes from the large water cycle, or the rain comes from the large water cycle. But actually, the small water cycle also plays a significant amount of creating.
Well, that's the good news, though, isn't it? Because that means that everyone can really participate in making change, in restoring the cycle of water.
Yeah, because the small water cycle is affected by what we do to the land. So if your soil absorbs more of the rain, or your forest, helps, kind of bring that rain into the ground, then more of the water is held in the land as opposed to run off and back to the ocean. And so that water then is evapotranspired back by the soil and by the trees into adding to the moisture in the air that's blowing from the ocean, then creates more rain. And so for instance, Milan was a Spanish meteorologist, head of a large meteorology organization, and he was asked by the European Union why Spain was losing rain. And
Could you say again why Spain
was losing its rain over the decade? And he found out that it was because they were chopping down the forests and paving over the land, so they're not having that evapotranspiration. And in Iberia, Portugal and Spain, particularly poignant because the moisture in the air from the ocean is just about below the amount that you need to get the humidity point for the clouds, for the water to condense into clouds. And so you need that extra evapotranspiration to push it over that hump and create more rain. So there's certain parts of the world where it's especially poignant. And, California and Australia, in certain latitudes, there's these, what you do to the land has even more effect than maybe in some other places on the rain.
So what did Spain do to address that once they had the information and understood what was causing that it was the deforestation that was leading to the loss of their rainfall?
So they got interested, but then as he pushed into, some of the government got a little bit scared because it meant they had to stop the development, and that was impacting a lot of tourism and other
economy. Right. Well, these are all kind of false narratives.
I mean, it's a problem with it's the same issue with carbon too. Like it impacts the whole gas industry and petrol industry. So like whatever the solution does have a big impact. But anyway, he ran into roadblocks to try and get this happening in Spain, the restoration.
Well, I think a lot of this just shows why. I mean, we say the conversation has focused so much on carbon versus water and soil because we know that's elementary. Anyone in the regenerative movement, a permaculturist, indigenous peoples, they all know that they know actually the answer lies in the water and soil restoration. So it's not, I would say it's more deliberate than it is ignorance. It's kind of deliberate to keep current power structures in play, to keep people disempowered, to keep the fear going. Because if you know that we can change it, which everybody does know that's possible who's in this regenerative movement, that it could happen in a very short order, actually.
Or do you think it's not general knowledge? Like when I've talked to like more certain government officials or water people in California, they didn't know that you could create more rain or that you could restore the rain. It's not common knowledge, I think. Maybe in certain pockets of permaculture and eco work. But in
Yeah.
general, mainstream, it hasn't reached. No, I
No,
think people
not in the
realize
main.
it would be easier to push for it, but it's not that hasn't spread. And even the eco people don't think a lot of the scientists know. But if you look at the scientist literature, there's at least, I mean, I've found maybe 200, maybe 500 scientists. I mean, there's a lot of scientists that publish papers on this. There's like a whole
Right.
treasure trove of papers. So it's not like the climate scientists don't know this, but it's also a small part of climate science because the larger, much more energy is focused on the carbon and other aspects.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so even though there are a lot of scientists that have published papers and found this is a true effect, it still hasn't somehow even become a central topic in climate science because
Right.
of maybe so much focus on the carbon question.
But there is also, I mean, we see this in all governmental offices and departments that there is this co-opting. You know, many of us live in oligarchies, places where the corporate influence is massive. There's maybe the illusion of a real democratic government in play, but we know much of it is being run by corporations. And so there is interest in presenting different solutions that aren't natural, technological solutions. I wonder if you could speak to that. We know that there's many things happening around geoengineering and trying to do things like deflect the sun's radiation from the earth or cloud brightening. I wonder if you could address the things that are happening because those are things that can be patented that you can profit off of. And that's something that is a conversation we need to have because it takes the power away from people and local actions and things that people can actually do to reverse the changes.
Yeah, well, the more I look at the situation, the more there's two categories. It's called nature-based solutions, and there's something called, more gray infrastructure, which is more man-made infrastructure, concrete
Mhm.
and
Mm.
engineering. And
Mhm.
and what's interesting is there has been actually a shift, or at least a certain pocket of environmental science and climate science to look at more nature-based solutions. But there's also naturally also more technology. But and the more I look at it, the more it seems the nature-based solutions are actually much more powerful than we realize, in part because these things play multiple roles. So there's an idea in permaculture called stacking functions. So everything
Mhm.
performs many functions. So a tree
Right.
performs like 70 different functions,
Mhm.
and this, the things in the soil, the nematodes, like they're all performing multiple functions. The worms, the
Mhm.
plants are performing multiple functions. So when you kind of try to replace it, like when farming, when you try to replace fertilizer with synthetic
Mhm.
fertilizers, you're focusing on one vector.
Right.
You're kind of then you improve that vector a lot, and so that may lead to sudden improvements. But you're also decreasing them. You're getting rid of all those other functions that were being stacked, that were being done
Right.
by the natural
Mhm.
bacteria or the natural fungi or the natural fertilizers. And so it throws off the whole system. And it's
Right.
true in our health too, like our medical system is kind of focused on one vector and then thrown off
Yeah, it's very
significant
fragmented.
side effects. So there's all these side effects in regenerative agriculture and also in the climate, and if you're trying to do geoengineering. And so if you take the whole systems view where you're trying to understand how each part, like you're trying to improve all the variables as opposed to just one variable. But if you try to improve one variable, you can do a certain thing,
Right.
certain geoengineering thing, but then that can throw off other variables that are very important.
Right, or cause grave consequences as well, right? I mean, it's not a
Yeah.
holistic approach at all, right?
Right.
It's like singular, instead
Yeah,
of
so even
understanding
like
the whole.
Yeah, so even dams, which the World Bank used to fund a lot, like they are actually now saying, hey, we should fund the deconstruction of dams because the dams have the problem that they catch all the silt. And so that silt usually would flow during the wet season, flow over the banks because it would overflow. And that would
Mm-hmm.
become soil. And then
In
that
the
water
water,
would then seep into the aquifers and build up the floodplains. And
sure.
now you don't have all that natural cycle, and all that
Mm-hmm.
silt just gets stuck at the dam. And
Right.
it also stops, like in certain places where the salmon, like the salmon actually
Spawning.
usually go up. Yeah. And they would actually provide 80% of some of the forest certain nutrients. And so the forests actually depend on the bears eating the salmon and then pooping and then creating that fertilizer. And so there's all these natural cycles. And so those forests are not getting as much nutrients. And so that means they're actually affecting the small water cycle because the forests are not so rich and biodiverse and as plentiful. And so there's all these ripple effects of when you're doing something like a dam, which seems like the natural way to bring more water to everyone, but it actually throws off the whole system. And so in the Western US, like we dammed up the Colorado River, But that
Mhm.
means that the whole end of the Colorado River, that's now just a trickle now. And so all that area, which was fertile and
Mhm.
all the wildlife, all it's gone. And that usually has a small water cycle that would blow back and create rain. But now it's being pumped to LA and San Diego and
Mhm.
Arizona. And so those places, Arizona thinks they have enough water, but really not because they're drying up the Colorado River.
Right.
And but they're not seeing that problem. And so more people move to Arizona and then there's more problems. So this kind of creates this movement of people to where the water shouldn't be, and that's creating more stresses. And so it leads to so you have less near-term problems because you're getting the water from the Colorado, but it's leading to this possibly catastrophic issue. And a
Down
lot
the
of
line.
government legislators are now worried that the whole river could collapse, like in the
Mhm.
2040 or 2050, and
Mhm.
because there's 7 states overdrawing the
Mhm. Mhm.
Colorado River.
Right. It's like kicking the can down the line. But I think that's because we don't have this sort of indigenous perspective of looking to future generations, how they would, how some look to the seven generations or this kind of way that there's actually repercussions. And you have to consider all of those before taking any actions. It's
Right.
kind of not the Western way. It's very unilateral, actually.
Hmm.
Well, one more question on the geoengineering. So, what is your feeling about that, of the things that are being done as far as injecting aerosols into the sky? I mean, there's crazy plans that to me just interrupt and further divorce us from nature because
Yeah,
we are not aligning
I
with nature.
I haven't looked into that, but I my feeling is that it's not very good. There'll be lots of
No.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, how could it be, to be, well, I mean, we already do things like cloud seeding, but we know this is on a much more major scale. I mean, to deflect the sun's radiation away from the earth sounds like a very bad idea for plants, right?
yeah.
So when we know that we can restore the soil, I mean, we have to look really to, I think, a lot of the indigenous ways of how they were able to exist here for millennia. And in short order, we have disrupted the entire sequences of life on the planet. But,
Mm.
I wonder if you could could explain how microorganisms contribute to rain.
Yeah. So what's interesting, like the microbiome in the body, like we didn't think it used to be important, but now it's like more and more important. We realize, oh, it's all these bacteria, this
Hmm.
micro stuff that's actually playing a significant role in our health. And Lynn Margulis, who actually was one of the helped James Lovelock find the Gaia theory, she was actually did a lot with bacteria. She found it a symbiotic thing. And she was really intrigued with the whole idea of what microorganisms and bacteria did to the earth. And they actually played a major role because they
Hmm.
created oxygen. She was curious about all the other gases too, nitrogen and what role. And so actually the microorganisms are actually influencing all this in the atmosphere. So it's a dynamic atmosphere that we have. It's a non-equilibrium. It's because of all the microorganisms. So they're playing a huge role in regulating all the chemical cycles on the earth, and phosphorus and sulfur and all these things.
Hmm.
And and so and they played major roles in the transition. And so just like the microbiome in the body is important, the microbiome for the earth is also really key. And what
Hmm.
well, not recent, but in the 70s, they started figuring out, oh, the bacteria could actually seed the rain better than dust can because this certain type of bacteria, it's called Pseudomonas syringae, could
Hmm.
seed it at a higher temperature. So the clouds would form in warmer places easier with this. And then later they found that, oh, fungi spores can also seed rain, and then also
Hmm.
this stuff from the lichens. And so it's becoming the scientists are discovering more and more about how these microorganisms are actually playing a role in seeding the rain. And when they seed it, then those bacteria come down, and so they actually travel. And
Hmm.
so they kind of like creating their own environment. And the fungi also are creating more rain, and they get blown to different areas where they then spawn more fungi and then get blown. And so it's this kind of a feedback loop of
Hmm.
what's happening with
Hmm.
the bacteria and fungi. It's almost creating their own microclimates where they are.
Hmm. And isn't the key to having more of these microorganisms, vegetation, planting more
Yeah.
trees, planting more plants so that that they exist?
Right. Yeah.
We're going to go to a break right now, listeners,
Okay.
and we'll be right back with Alpha Low of the Climate Water Project.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests, and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to the Climate Water Project, Rehydrating the Earth, with host Carrie Kim and guest Alpha Lowe, who publishes the Climate Water Project newsletter and hosts the Climate Water Project podcast.
Listeners, we're back with Alpha Lowe of the Climate Water Project. Alpha, could you share how forests create rain?
Yeah, so there's a couple aspects to why they create rain. One is that they're much better at absorbing the rain because all the logs absorb a lot of rain. The soil underneath is very rich with carbon matter, which absorbs more rain than less rich soil.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like this place. And so when it absorbs and holds more water, it then can also evapotranspire that water back up into the air. So that adds to the moisture in the air. So that's one reason. The other thing is that the forest releasing these microorganisms, so that's helping seed it. And then there's another third reason is that the forests also slow the wind. So it actually creates turbulence, which then goes up to about 1 kilometer in height. And so that slows the water vapor. And so when they slow, they're more likely to find each other and nucleate into cloud drops.
Could you explain, it seems really elementary, but if you could explain evapotranspiration, because again, I think we need to keep the education going so that people more pay attention to this. We're so in this modern world and technological world that some people are not even outside in nature to even observe, natural phenomena much these days. So if you could share what is evapotranspiration.
Yeah, so trees actually transpire water, and they also have a photosynthesis process where they actually, in photosynthesis, there's also a water molecule that at one side of the equation. And so they release this water, and it actually has a cooling effect too. It's kind of like sweat when you release it from your skin.
And how that cools you when you sweat.
Yeah, so that's the transpiration of the trees, and then there's also evaporation from the soil. And so anyway, when you use one word to sum up the evaporation and the transpiration, and then you call it evapotranspiration.
And obviously, again, we go back to the plants needing more trees. We need to reforest. We need to green the earth, actually the entire earth, especially the barren and degraded places that are exposed. Could you explain the difference between rain and precipitation?
They're the same thing. There's just two different words. More scientific. But I just want to go back to the forest too, like to regreen that.
Jeff Lawton would disagree with you.
Really?
He goes into a much deeper explanation of precipitation versus rain. And anyway.
Oh, really? Okay. To me, they're the same thing. So
That's okay. Sorry, what did you want to go back to?
Yeah, so you don't always want to plant trees. So what's key is that you need enough groundwater, and so sometimes you plant a non-native tree that sucks a lot of water out. So like avocado tree in central California, say, or the
almond trees in the wrong place, right? California.
Eucalyptus trees in Portugal and Spain, which are sucking up more water than is being sunk in. So and sometimes monoculture plantations, if they're too dense, also bring up too much water. So it's best these more diverse, biodiverse forests. And it's actually more key that we really restore old forests, old growth forests, and stop them being cut down. So there's a saying, permaculture: slow it, sink it, spread it. So you slow the water down and sink it down, and then you spread it around. And so that's the guiding principle of what you should do with the water, so it infiltrates the land. And then I added two things: lift it and hop it. So slow it, sink it, spread it, lift it, hop it. So that you want the trees.
Was it the last two? Sorry, I couldn't hear you. If you could
lift it and hop it.
Lift it and
hop it. Hop it.
Hop it.
As in moisture hop, as in hop, skip, jump.
Oh, hop and hop it. Okay.
Yeah. So when the trees can lift it, so when they transpire that water, it's lifting it up, or their tree roots bring it up from the groundwater, so it lifts it up, and then it hops. So say there's water transpired in California, it can blow wind inland, and then it can actually hop, say the Midwest or the Great Plains. And so actually the droughts in 2012 from the Midwest and the Great Plains were in part due to the Southwest drought 3 months early, because it took that long to hop. So that's the saying of kind of like, so permaculture kind of thinks about how to sink it in the land, and I'm just adding lift it and hop it to think also about the part in the atmosphere. But there is a key thing: you want the sinking part to be greater or equal to the lifting part. If you're not sinking that much water, like you're not replenishing the groundwater, then certain trees will lift more than it's being sunk, and then they'll dry out that land. So
Mm,
some of the tree, it's great we have a tree planting craze now, but sometimes it that they do it problematic with these like too
yeah.
dense monocultures.
Or it's overzealous and then the trees aren't sustained and they die in a year.
Yeah, so there's a way to kind of have to look at the water because yeah, if they're not watering too, and you don't want to use up too much water, so you want the natural water cycle. So if it's done right in the right things, and what's really probably a good rule of thumb is to find where there are forests and try to expand those forests. And you can actually let the animals do it too, because the squirrels will plant seeds and the monkeys will, or or the birds will propagate. So there's an actually natural way of rewilding too that can actually, you don't need humans necessarily in some places
Right.
to actually be the ones growing the forest. And in fact, if we rely on the animals, it's more of a natural way that's probably more likely to go right.
Sure, of course. I mean, what do you think about E.O. Wilson's Half Earth project to conserve half of the Earth? And it's closer to wilderness, these places, these sites. And it's not like it's just dividing the Earth in half, but it's like different sites around the world where there's greater biodiversity and more fertility already, and to preserve those places from kind of interference from humans.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. Yeah, there's this thing in rewilding. I don't know if you've heard of rewilding. It's like kind of
Yes,
trying to bring back the animals. Like if
yes,
you get to a certain large enough area, like if a smaller rewilding project, you still need humans to guide it a bit. But if you get
right,
to a certain large enough area, the animals can actually self-organize and self-regulate. And so I
sure,
think it's important to really have these super large regions of rewilded land. And if you have really large regions, they'll actually repopulate certain animals that can then actually go to other places that are not kind of so wild. And
right.
I think this is a great, this half Earth, and yeah, it would be great if we could do the half Earth.
Hmm.
And it will require a whole cultural shift, like,
Sure.
and because we have to start thinking about almost undevelopment or
Yes.
saving, and there's a way to actually tie that into an economic system. Like, there's something called extractive economics, sustainable economics, and
Hmm.
regenerative economics. And extractive, that's kind of what a lot of what we're doing now.
Right.
Sustainable economics trying to sustain stuff like recycle and
Hmm.
reuse.
Hmm.
But regenerative economics is actually trying to restore the economic ecology itself, which the
Hmm.
sustainable economy doesn't do, but it's also necessary to get us to the regenerative economy. And so we need a regenerative economy which actually starts to grow the amount of ecology we have.
Right.
And that can also be profitable. Like, for instance, there is, like some YouTube channels like Mossy Earth where people donate and they watch that being
Right.
regenerated. And so that money goes. And there's a lot of this restoration, this deforestation and denaturing has led to more floods and
Sure.
fires and droughts.
Hmm.
The floods, because if you take away the forest, it doesn't absorb uphill and then it goes into the cities.
And then it
And
erodes and yeah, floods.
yeah, and the fires are because, yeah, we've destroyed the small water cycle. There's a lot less water. And then if you extract all the groundwater, the trees can't bring up that water in the dry season. And then the winds are less humid because there's less groundwater being pulled up. And groundwater actually can create rain too if there's enough because it's being pulled because the trees pull it up in the dry
If
season.
there's trees though, right? I mean, you need the
Yeah.
trees to pull up the
Yeah. So
groundwater.
you need the trees and the groundwater. Yeah. So wait, what was I trying to get to? What was what was I talking about?
Well, I mean, I think we basically covered a lot of that as far as using the groundwater to be able to create rain as well. That's a key factor.
Oh yeah, so I was going to say this is how you can build the regenerative economy is that if you can get enough people really concerned, because there's a lot of people experiencing fires now and floods.
Right.
If
Yes.
you can say, hey, would we regenerate this amount?
Hmm.
And so like if all the farmers who depend on all that rain and the
Right.
government who depend on the protecting from fire, like you create these collective funds like the Rio Grande fund they did in New Mexico, I think, where they collected millions to restore
Hmm.
water. Like you collect that money and then you use that to restore, or you use that as fire insurance. You get people to buy fire insurance or flood insurance. And
Hmm.
so that would be a regenerative economy. You're kind of funneling money into a business or the government entities that actually do this work. And so, but it's actually increasing the amount of ecology. And
Hmm.
so, and also there's ways to increase ecology for health benefits. The more nature
Sure.
around it, people have health. And so if we can kind of figure out economic way then this whole regenerative economy that might possibly get us to the half Earth can happen. And
Hmm.
it also requires a huge cultural shift to actually start enjoying being in nature more. because a lot of
Mhm.
people might find it boring being in nature, but if you can start educating, oh, there's so many trees to look at and plant
Right.
varieties, soil types, and the way the river works and habitats in the river, like there's so many exciting things, but we're not
Yeah.
paying attention to that.
Yeah.
If people get excited by that, and if like your yoga starts happening
Mhm.
outside and
Yeah.
work
Yes.
starts being outdoor offices, then people actually want more outdoorness and people
Mhm.
invest in it, and maybe that transition will happen faster.
Well, I think it's also because people are used to being overstimulated. And so to go into a place where you're in nature is kind of like your nervous system is usually in overdrive. And so people, it's an adaptation for people, but it's not natural to be that overstimulated. And it's not healthy, as we know. People's nervous systems are just on the brink for many people. So
Right.
what would you say for yourself, from your vantage point, everything that you know, everything that you studied, what does restoring the hydrological cycle look like? What does it include from your vantage point?
So it's a lot about slowing the water. And
Hmm.
so these things that permaculture is called swales, where you kind of like in a garden dig a little hole. And so that slows the water or guides it into the groundwater where it moves
Hmm.
a lot slower and can come out in springs in the dry season. And then it's kind of restoring our rivers, and because the rivers, a lot of them channelize and they funnel the water a lot faster out to the ocean.
Right.
It
Yes. It's just
yeah,
gone.
yeah,
It's gone from the land.
yeah. So it's kind of looking at like a lot, like California, I think is like several thousand dams or something, and like there's just way too many dams, and so
Yes.
we kind of look at deconstructing, and also the levees is a problem, and we need to kind of start moving people off the floodplains. Like in China, they've managed to do it because they're more of a hierarchical government. But in Seattle, they were rebuying land to buy back
Hmm.
floodplains because that's the natural way you build the absorbency of your cities. And so there's this whole sponge city movement that the Chinese started, but now spreading to other countries where, it's rain gardens and then things in the roads where you guide the water instead of straight into the sewers, like guide into the trees next to the roads and the
Hmm.
biospheres they're called. And so there's all these
Hmm.
green
Curb
roofs.
cuts, like what's going on in Arizona, or like the Brad Lancaster kind of way of harvesting
Yeah.
rainfall. And
Right. Yeah. So yeah, Brad Lancaster pioneered kind of guiding those curb cuts, so the water
could you
guides
explain
along.
that? Because some people may not be familiar with that work,
Yeah.
of what
So
a curb
so the
cut
whole
even is.
idea is you want to slow the water down, but roads actually, if you think about, really speed up the water, and they're almost like these channels that funnel the water off, and they're really problematical. And it's huge amounts of water. If you look at the speeds, like in floods, like they carry away cars, and so anyway, there's a lot of water. So the roads are actually big problematical, and so you actually want to guide some of that water going down roads. And so what Brad Lancaster did was he guided into the trees and the grasses next to the road. And you can also guide into your gardens. And so then that water isn't just going to the sewage and funneling out away. It's actually being into the soil and utilized for growing stuff. And
Hmm.
so if this was happening a lot of places,
And it's
uh,
bringing back biodiversity too, right along the street and in the medians.
yeah. So where he did it is in dry places, but it's actually really good where there's a lot of floods too. If you higher up in the landscape, if you have a lot more of the water being funneled off the roads into the gardens, then it's not going to all just flash flood
Right.
down and
Yeah,
go at
right,
high
right,
speed
right.
through the urban areas.
So
And
that's
I
less
think,
problematic.
yeah, so I feel like the roads, there's a huge amount of possibility with our road system because they actually cover 10% of the land in some places.
Hmm.
And that's a
Oh,
huge
especially
amount.
here on Tongvalans, aka Los Angeles, would be an incredible place to do such a project because we know the majority of the water off the roads in California just go straight back to the ocean.
Yeah, there is some movement in LA to kind of do this. I think I forget the name of the group that's doing it, but yeah, and parking lots and unfortunately, LA is very paved over, and
Yeah.
they concretized their rivers too because they were worried about the floods in the early 1900s, and but now they do have, I think, a head of Department of Trees in LA, and so LA needs to regreen because it's also heating up because of the urban heat wave.
Sure.
There's so much
Hmm.
concrete,
And
and
we have a
so
lot of pollution as well. It's trapping, right? Trapping the heat because
yeah,
there's so much particulate matter in the air as well.
right.
The return.
And
Could
and
you?
LA has kind of built it around cars, and there also needs to be a movement to relocalize like where we work and that's also a deep cultural shift that we have to do some deep thinking around because LA, I mean, San Francisco actually is a little better at localization up north of LA, but LA somehow spread itself so much that it's almost hard to get around without a car, and that leads to even more concretization. And so it's tied up with the idea of relocalizing our environments too.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think they try to do all these multi-use projects, but it's just more concrete. There's not a lot of green happening with those projects. It's just a lot more building development, and it's kind of more of the same. It's
Yeah,
high density, but it's not actually adding more biodiversity. It's actually reducing biodiversity.
yeah.
Yeah.
There was actually about 9 big wetland projects in LA, like in Burbank. They wanted to funnel all the stormwater to these wetland parks, and it was a very expensive project, and over decades. And I don't know what the stage at they are
Hmm.
right now, if they're still happening, but they would be very good because they were realizing, oh, LA could store a lot of the water in the aquifers below LA instead of having to get so much from Colorado River. So
Sure.
the impetus around this project, like hundreds of millions of dollars, I think we're going to be allocated probably to this project. I don't know where it is right now, but
Yeah.
if
Well,
it is going to still happen, that would be very good for LA.
well, it's incredible to think about how many wetlands used to exist here on the coast of California.
Yeah, and Beverly Hills, I think, was part of a wetlands, and it was an intersection of rivers, and like yeah, like LA used to have, it's called artesian. They had artesian wells, which means if you put a little hole in the ground, water would just spout out.
Come
Like
out. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that's how much water LA has, and
And
somehow it
springs. We
dried
had many,
itself
many
up.
springs as well, thousands of springs.
Yeah, so it's water rich, and we've kind of destroyed LA, and it's no longer water rich. But we can return it somewhat because enough water does fall in Southern California that it should be able to absorb if LA wants to become more of a sponge city. Maybe they can learn from the Chinese.
That's really amazing. When did China do their first sponge city?
I'm not totally sure. I think it's the last couple years because they had huge problems with floods, like millions of people were
Right.
displaced. And so there was a guy who wasn't, I forget his name, Kong Lian or something, and he was not, the Chinese did not like it. But then when they realized he had the solution, they turned to his sponge city. And they actually built on some ancient Chinese principles of, rain absorption and stuff. And so he kind of built it cultural. Actually, a lot of old cultures had some version of good water practice. And so
Sure.
when you try to bring it back modern, you can actually turn to say, hey, in ancient practices, we did this
Hmm.
and this. And
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah, like in
definitely.
Colombia and Peru. I mean, all these countries, they
Peru,
have
yes.
interesting, good practice and they have interesting names. So in permaculture, they call it swales and ponds and terraces. But actually, there's different names in, like in India, we call it Johad, and in
Hmm.
South America came up with their own version of it. And then, yeah, and then versions of check dams, which are the way
Hmm.
putting rocks in the creeks to slow it down. And anyway, there's all sorts of inventions that the indigenous people invented over and over again with different names in each culture, which is kind of interesting if you track it.
Yeah, if you track it and go back. I mean, I know I saw something that a video with Jeff Lawton, and he was in this gigantic cistern. It was thousands of years old, in Jordan. And just to see how water used to be stored underground in that way, and they would draw
Mm.
upon it for their uses. But you know, I wonder if you could share, just we're going to break in a minute, but is there any specific research that you're actively engaged in right now that you're motivated about?
Well, I'm really intrigued by how groundwater can lessen the wildfires. And I
Hmm.
think groundwater can create rain. And so there's some tentative research that shows that groundwater is creating rain. Like Francisca Dominguez, the University of Illinois professor, she showed the Amazon that I think her model was that 10% of the rain came from the
Groundwater?
groundwater. And that's because and that 10% because Amazon has so much rain would be maybe
Hmm.
a larger percentage somewhere else.
Right.
And there's UC Berkeley, the Hydro Watch group found that in the dry season, the trees actually bring up a lot more groundwater than we think,
Hmm.
hydrate themselves, except that in California, we've depleted the groundwater, so the trees can no longer reach.
Right.
And so I think it's really key if we can get the groundwater to the levels that the trees can reach, and that will help keep the winds more humid and keep the landscape more hydrated. And so I think we need more research at how groundwater creates rain because
Hmm.
because we're depleting the groundwater everywhere
Right.
around the world is like massive depletion of groundwater. And
Mhm.
if it is, then we have a worldwide movement to stop fires because they're happening in all the different continents to get the groundwater to the tree root level.
Mhm.
Anyway, I think we need a lot more research on that. And I think
Ah,
that's a aspect because the fires are a huge problem because it's
issue globally,
creating this
yes.
desertification issue, which will then create even more issues. Because if you're burning down all the trees, then we also have even less of those small water cycles. So it's actually a very dangerous point we're at, especially in California and Australia and Portugal and Spain, where this cycle of fire, flood, drought is more severe because they're at those latitudes where the evapotranspiration from the soil and the forest pushes the moisture over to create rain. So at those levels, those areas are kind of like the ground zero of this desertification issue. So
Mhm.
Zach Weiss calls it the watershed death spiral. And so we really need to figure out, because it's also hard because you can't totally reforest because there's also wildfires. So it's already in a very delicate stage
Right.
of how you guide California, Australia, and Spain and Portugal back to a healthy small water cycle.
Mhm.
And each year that goes by, it gets harder and harder. So anyway, so these are critical points. And I really feel like this research about groundwater and connection to wildfire is really key.
Can make a big
No
impact.
one's really looking
Alpha,
at
we're
it.
going to take a break right here and come right back, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about this groundwater and how it can support us restoring the small water cycles.
Hmm.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests, and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to the Climate Water Project, Rehydrating the Earth, with host Carrie Kim and guest Alpha Lowe, who publishes the Climate Water Project newsletter and hosts the Climate Water Project podcast.
So, Alpha, could you just explain a little bit more about the groundwater? We know the groundwater depletion, a lot of that in California is from oil, from fracking, from bad or poor agricultural practices. We're drawing up a lot of water instead of retaining the water in the soil by using regenerative principles to grow food. If you could speak a little bit more, if there's anything more you'd like to share about
Yeah.
how changing
So
our
there's
groundwater conversation.
yeah. So at least now in groundwater, in California, they actually passed a groundwater act, so you can no longer keep just depleting it. But it's like so deep that like I think in some places it's the ground is dropped like 30 feet or something because there's so much water gone that the ground can't hold up.
And like you said, that's not where the tree roots can actually reach them. I don't know how many trees have that kind of deep root.
Right. And so part of the problem is that we've focused on certain crops in California, like almonds and avocados that are very water intensive. And
Mhm.
like they bring in money, but they're actually very problematical. And so
Yeah.
we want to use more certain wiser use of crops that we grow in California. And also we have to look at growing food more locally too, especially where it's more rain and not have California try to be so much of a breadbasket for the rest of the US, I think. And so because because the problem is that right now California has to pipe in most of that water from the Colorado River, which then leads to this whole problem with the Colorado River. Actually, I mean, they're piping it up, sorry, from the northern California, from the Shasta area.
Mhm. Mhm.
But
From Shasta.
the piping it, but that piping in creates problems, and
Sure. Well, it's incredible that we do that when we know that we can actually have local water. And we did have a local water cycle. I mean, I've lived in California for many, many decades. And just thinking about how much rain we used to have here back in the 70s to how much rain we have now, it's kind of shocking
yeah,
when you think about it. But we know that the answers, I just go back to Bill Mollison, that the answers are embarrassingly simple and they remain so, you know.
yeah.
But it's a matter of engaging that and actually doing that. Are there some parts of the world right now that are inspiring you? I know you talk a lot about Maharashtra. I don't know if there's other places that and then you've mentioned China and the sponge cities. Are there any other regions of the world where you feel that they're really making advances in bringing back the balance
Well,
with
yeah. Let's share
nature?
about the Maharashtra thing. So in India, it's a region in
Mhm.
India, and so they have 8,000 villages doing this thing called the Water Cup, where they're kind of competing, friendly competition, where they're also helping each other to see who can restore the most water. And
Mm.
so, because a lot of villagers were leaving to go to the cities, and because they don't have enough water for their crops, and so, but they have a lot of rain in the monsoon season, so they built ponds and to capture the water for the dry season, and also to increase the groundwater. Some of it would seep through the bottom of the ponds, and then they also regreen those areas. And so, in the process, the villagers are no longer leaving to go to the big cities because they're now growing crops again. And so
Mhm.
this is a very successful approach. And so it'd be interesting to see how we could replicate some of this elsewhere, this kind of communal competition, maybe.
Mhm.
I feel like you could have or you could have, the whole permaculture, they do this kind of permaculture design for like their land, but
Right.
tap into then the permaculture guilds for their region, have the permaculture guilds design watershed plans for the whole region, and then
Hmm.
present these to the local government. So there's this whole transition town movement. I don't know if it was
Yeah.
transition town happened in Britain,
Mhm.
where the permaculturists actually brought a plan to their town council of how you create more local economy, how they
Mhm.
relocalize stuff and grow more vegetation. And so it then spread to other parts of the world. So it's actually a worldwide movement, although it's faltered in momentum a bit, but it has spread to Australia and US, and many cities do it. Well,
Mhm.
the transition movement could actually design watershed plans, like, and then come up with that
Mhm.
and have the tap into their permaculture students, and then kind of that could reactivate the whole transition town, I think, model. And because it also is important because one town upwind of another will affect the amount of rain a town maybe
Sure.
100 miles or 500 miles downwind will. And so if you could tap into places that have this network and kind of do these local watershed restoration work,
Mhm.
then you kind of build a movement. And
Well,
some
on
other
your Substack, I mean, I think it was your Substack when you talk about how local people can begin restoring their watershed. I wonder if you could give a few suggestions for people who would like to participate in that where they are locally.
yeah,
What
so
do you recommend they do?
I mean, you could do small things like if you want to do something physical, like just watch where the rain goes outside, watch where the rain flows in the soil or through the city, and that'll give you some sense. And then you can also read up about how you could play around with swales or curb cuts or otherwise to guide this water and just play around with it, and maybe learn some permaculture or syntropic farming or some of these techniques if you have a yard. And then the other thing is just to bring up with your friends and people at work and say, hey, do you know about if your area has, a flood, drought, or fire problem? And now most areas have one of these problems. You bring up, hey, did you know there's a water cycle solution? And I have different essays on my Substack, the climatewaterproject.substack.com. If you want to take a look, and then maybe invite them to look at that article, maybe discuss it. Or there's other people that are writing about this, like Michael Kravich with the New Water Paradigm, or Erica Gies with her
Mm.
book What Always Wins. Zach
Mhm.
White, his water stories, videos on
Water
YouTube.
stories.
Yeah, and Anna Fitzgibbon has a book, Rehydrate the Earth. So there's different people with resources out there. And you could start a little book club if you can get enough interest. Just start engaging people in discussion and then read, one of my essays or read a paper or read one of these books and discuss it. And so that starts building this momentum. And then
Mhm.
start trying to give little talks, maybe 1 minute talk, 5 minute talks, get your friends to feedback, maybe get some of these experts you find on social media. Water Stories as a community, you could ask questions. Facebook as a water and climate group, like kind of get feedback. And so then you start giving talks, but you could say you're
Right.
not an expert. You could give it at your library. And so that kind of starts, you want to get, momentum building. And then you can weave maybe different groups, the permaculture, or maybe there's a Audubon club or
Mhm.
Rotary Club, try to get different groups kind of excited about it. Maybe you could give it talks at different places.
Yeah.
Yeah, create
It's
a
just
kind of
galvanizing people, right? It's educating and galvanizing people around it because they're not receiving this information. It's not coming, from the media to them. You actually have to seek it out, essentially. It's not going to just fall into your lap,
yeah.
generally.
You can be the change in your town, and you're the one that's activating, or you could grow whatever is happening. Maybe there's a watershed council and kind of bring. Sometimes they're more interested in restoring their creeks, but maybe you could say, hey, there's this actually bigger issue of small water cycle and restoring the rain and the dealing with floods and fires and kind of like somehow get people excited. And then once you build that excitement, then it's easier to pass local policy or, build a bioregional design center or kind of link with other groups and kind of
Yeah.
build. But I think each of us in our watersheds can start building that energy. And
Mhm.
there will be a large water movement starting to happen now in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And
Mhm.
different groups I could see. So as you build your thing and your local thing, you may think you're doing it alone and there's not much, but there's going to be this tidal wave of water stuff that's going to be happening because there's this water scarcity and because we're so dependent on water.
Mhm.
Uh, it's going to be a huge thing in the next 5 years. So
Yeah.
start
I
building
dream of the
now.
day when everybody globally mobilizes to address water and soil and we just drop everything else basically and just work on this. I mean, I feel that is the most critical thing in our times to do.
Yeah, Kevin Costner had, I think in Field of Dreams was a build it and they will come. If you
Hmm.
start building the connections and the community around water in your place, the larger movement will come, and you'll be there to kind of ride the wave.
Yeah.
Just because
Oh,
it's so key and we're so destroying it that it's going to become big in the next few years.
right. Yeah. There's a point. We're at that pivot point. Could you explain what the biotic pump is?
Yeah, so there's this theory by Anastasia Makareva and Viktor Gorshov, these Russian physicists and meteorologists. And they posited that when the evapotranspiration, the water vapor moves up, when it condenses, so it condenses in a cloud. So when you condense, all that water, because liquid water takes up much less room, 2,000 times less room than water vapor. So suddenly there's this vacuum. And so that vacuum, if you've ever sucked a vacuum out of a large steel drum, it will just crush, it will just implode. And so they think that implosion energy will draw up a lot of water, and it'll create a cycle that will actually suck in water vapor from the ocean. So it creates a cycle. And there's some people that argue actually the latent heat effect is more important than the vacuum. And it is much larger, but they say that the latent heat so there's a latent heat means there's heat release when the water vapor condenses into cloud. So that also sucks up it also sucks up the air below. That also creates a loop. And Rong Fu, a meteorologist at UCLA, she has a theory that the Amazon does this with the latent heat, and it also sucks in the ocean. So it's a kind of a similar mechanism to the biotic pump. And I think hers is a bit more accepted. But whichever one, if one of them is true, it's great, because that means that the forests are initiating the wet season early and creating rain. And so the Congo rainforest and the Amazon rainforest, this is a really key thing of how they create more moisture and more rain. And they feed actually the rest of South America for the Amazon and parts of Africa for the Congo. So it's really key to restore those things, especially like the Great Green War in Africa. People are not looking at how important it is to restore the Congo, because that water is going up, and it may be coming from the biotic pump, or maybe coming in from this mechanism that Rong Fu has been describing.
It's like what you say. I mean, that the world is interdependent, and realizing that the lack of rainfall or storms in one area affects every other part of the earth. That's the thing that I think a lot of us don't fundamentally really truly understand. Just like what Milan and the storms in the Mediterranean, or regreening the Sinai Peninsula, how that can change the whole rest of the trajectory of weather elsewhere.
Yeah. So, and even like the Amazon, because there's this thing called jet streams, which connect the northern and southern hemisphere. And so actually regreening the Amazon, it will affect the Midwest, so they actually have less drought. So that's also a curious property. There's all these in the US. So there's actually these global effects. It's called teleconnections. If you change the forest in one continent, it can actually affect the rainfall in a different continent through various things like the Hadley cell, these large scale circulations, or through jet streams, which they affect.
Yeah, it's quite amazing how nature actually works, because there is so much that we don't actually know. We have the hubris to think that we know when it's so complex, and there's so many factors and variables, as you've mentioned. Could you also talk about, are there, I know you've mentioned that some climate scientists are moving more in the direction of nature-based solutions, but could you talk about, are there any engaging with Indigenous peoples and trying to see how Indigenous peoples used to relate with rain? Because one of the things that I think about is that we have all this focus on science, but we're kind of missing integrating science with the rest of our lives, our spiritual lives, our connection with nature. There was a time, and there are still people who can call rain. They can call rain by dancing or chanting and praying, and humanity used to have the capacity to do such things, but we no longer live in these animist ways. I wonder if you have anything to say about that, because we can't just be moving in a scientific direction. We need to integrate that science with the rest of our life.
Yeah, I agree. And I do see sometimes in scientific papers, there is some of them talking about Indigenous, but I don't think that's a large majority. But it was interesting to me to see that was actually happening. So I think there are certain scientists that are looking at this, especially the nature-based solutions crowd. There's a subsection of the nature-based solution crowd that
is subculture
interested in the Indigenous. I mean, even permaculture, they didn't acknowledge it that well, but they took a lot from the Indigenous idea.
Yeah, and originated from there, I would say.
Yeah, the Aborigines. And actually the Aborigines, they have these dot paintings, and I found out that these dot paintings they're actually mapping groundwater. And so it's kind of interesting how they had all this knowledge about the groundwater, even though, yeah, So
Yeah, because they have their connection. I mean, they have connections coming from spirit and from the land and from the ancestors, and it's a very different kind of life. When you talk about the Gaia perspective, could you explain what that is? And
yeah, Guy was a perspective. James Lovelock and then later Lynn Margulis joined him, looking at how Earth is a self-regulating system,
Mhm.
and it's almost the life forms, the biology plays a huge role in the climate. And
Mhm.
when he proposed that it was actually self-regulating, and it's kind of now integrated into a lot of earth science, some of these feedback loops of how,
Mhm.
it's kind of like his idea was like, say, an organism could self-regulate its temperature.
Mhm.
So James Lovelock was pondering, can the Earth too self-regulate its temperature? And so he posited certain mechanisms. And I think it is still a paradigm that still has to be fleshed out more, that there probably is ways, because we're finding out that the global warming is actually kind of complex, because the clouds, like almost a plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius, depending on how you do the computer modeling. So it's actually
Mhm.
quite more complex. And there's all this processes involving the microorganisms and involving the dust and different aerosols. And there's so much complexity. And like a higher cloud will cool the earth a bit more, while a lower cloud might heat it up. I mean,
Mhm.
sorry, the other way around. And so even the height of the cloud has a difference of whether it's heating or cooling the cloud. And then
Mhm.
whether the wind's blowing it, and whether it is so complex. But what if some of the complexity, instead of trying to approach it from a certain angle, try to approach it from a self-regulation angle? And maybe there's mechanisms, especially in all the nature has evolved in certain way, that's actually learned to self-regulate its heat.
Sure.
That would be a, a certain interesting way to kind of look at the whole global warming thing, because trees can affect like how much it evapotranspires, and the fungi can affect when they release their spores to affect cloud formation. And
Mm.
so, is there something that's happening? Is there a certain nature intelligence and that's actually influencing the climate? That's kind of coordinated, and that's what kind of James Lovelock started exploring. Like he actually put into the models herbivores and carnivores and then plants, and so there's certain simulations where actually, if you add in the herbivores and the carnivores, the temperature is even regulated even better. And you were like, well,
Mhm.
what was carnivores got to do with regulating the temperature of the earth?
Right.
Well, because the albedo of the plants were affected, but the herbivores would eat the plants, and the
Mhm.
carnivores would actually regulate how many herbivores. And so there's this kind of multi-stage, multi-trophic level regulation that's happening. So there's deep things, and it appeared in one of his computer models that I think hasn't been very explored very much. And so the whole rewilding thing, I mean, we know that beaver's important, and
Sure.
and Yellowstone, we saw that if we reintroduced the wolves, it affected the rivers, which affected the beavers. I mean, it cut down on the deer eating too much of the trees, and so there's this complex thing. But that what they didn't look at was that, actually the more trees they had in the Yellowstone was actually affecting the small water cycle.
Right.
So the rewilding is affecting. There's this complexity that's happening that I don't think people have really mapped out, or like of how the whole ecosystem is actually tied up with the water cycle, and
Mhm.
that there could be very deep, complex, emergent ways that the whole system is self-regulating.
I mean, I think it's kind of like going back to biomimicry, or really going further than that, because biomimicry really is also more of an indigenous way of respecting nature and seeing what natural laws are and seeing how nature actually balances and self-regulates. And I think there's not enough respect given to nature's inherent intelligence. Because I think that's because we live in this Anthropocene era. I blame Descartes, and this way of our kind of epistemologies, on how we learned. We've denied really the amount of learning that goes on in nature and nature's own evolutionary processes.
Yeah, so like the whole damming of the rivers, like if you dam one of our blood systems or you stop certain immune things or hormones, your whole system is going to go off. Well, we didn't realize that, and I don't know if we fully realize like how much importance the natural river flow is, because it's allowing that all that nutrients from the ocean to actually all the movement of all these molecules, certain complex molecules through the salmon and the bears, to actually go into inland, which then affects the trees, which affects the small water cycle. So there's this whole cycle of complex molecules that by damming up the rivers, we don't allow in those countries with salmon, but also, in other countries, there's different things that are happening when you dam the rivers. And so, yeah, so there's these natural natural systems, we need to understand more deeply what happens when we dam. And because we're so enmeshed in the dam culture, it's kind of hard to even question
Right.
and,
Well,
and
we've separated ourselves from nature. I mean, if we were living really in nature, it'd be a different thing. But we live in these boxes, a lot of us, and so we're separate. It's like we've created a separation between us and nature, and so that's a fundamental issue.
yeah. And if there are climate scientists listening, like I would say, hey, look at the effect of these dams. Like in the Colorado, when you dam it, all that water that's not going into the, near the
Soil.
Gulf
Yeah,
of
nourishing.
California, like all that 100 miles, like what happens to that evapotranspiration that's now not there, and how does that affect the whole water cycle in the US? That's not being looked at. Or in the Yangtze, where they hit the biggest dams, I think, in the world, like it's causing massive disruption in the whole water cycle.
Yeah.
How does all that water, where would have overflowed the floodplains, would have filled aquifers, like map
Yeah.
all that. So these are the important things that I think science. So I just said earlier that we need to do more studies about groundwater and fire. This is another thing I think we need to do is like look at the impact of the small water cycle when you do these dams, which is massive, and how that affects the water supply. Like, because there's governments all over the world spending billions of dollars trying to improve their water supply. They need to look at, okay, what happens if we undo a lot of these dams? How much maybe the rains would increase,
Yeah.
and
How
that
they be more
might
effective.
lead to a lot of undamming. Once these computer models show that undamming will start restoring a lot of our rain.
Alpha, thank you so much for your work in the world and all your efforts to also help educate and engage and activate other people around restoring the water cycles locally and globally. Could you share some of your links and how people can stay connected to your work and your Substack, and give us some links?
Yeah, so my newsletter, it's on Substack. It's climatewaterproject.substack.com, and Instagram it's at climatewaterproject. And yeah, so there's lots of essays about how you could deal with floods, fires, droughts, and there's lots of scientists. I just throw out some of the names that you might want to look: Milan Milan, Francina Dominguez, Herbert Sabanije, even the Nobel Prize winner Manabe, who founded the
Original climate model.
carbon greenhouse. He actually also did work about the soils absorbing more water and how that increased the rain. And so there's a lot of scientists that you might want to familiarize yourself. We really need, and that the public doesn't know how much scientists. And so if you read my articles, like propagate how much of the science and spread the names of these scientists so they become famous.
Definitely uplift all of them. Thank you so much, Alpha, for the Climate Water Project and all that you're doing. More power to your work, and to listeners, engage the work. We have to restore our own watersheds where we live and be a participant in bringing back the water and aligning with nature.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Alpha.
Thank you to our guest, Alpha Lowe, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been the Climate Water Project, Rehydrating the Earth. For an extended version of this interview, become a member of our Patreon and visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at Ecojustice Radio SoCal 350 and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard and you want others to be informed, subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show. A project of SoCal 350, this show can be found on KPFK, KPFT, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer, myself, Jack Eit. Co-host Jessica Aldridge, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.